Hello everyone, good evening and welcome to our Humanist UK event, Education Not Indoctrination, 125 Years Advancing Children's Rights. My name is Andrew Copson and I'm the Chief Executive of Humanist UK, but I first started my working life at Humanist UK, not as Chief Executive, but 16 years ago, working on our educational policy. I was the Education Policy and Campaigns Officer, working with our then Education Officer, Madeleine Mason, who did so much to advance humanist causes in the educational sphere. And as well as being the reason why I came here to work at Humanist UK, then BHA, the British Humanist Association, 16 years ago now, education issues were also the reason that I originally joined the BHA. It was in 2002 when the then Blair government was expanding the number and type and proportion of religious schools within the state system. And that was the issue that really galvanized my intention to support the BHA as the organization at the time was most prominent, most active and loudest in opposing that completely wrong-headed policy. And I know from the 20 years that I've spent as a member and the 16 years working for Humanist UK, that education issues of educational policy across the country and globally are one of the themes that motivate our members and supporters more than any other. In my time working on these issues, we were focusing on state-funded religious schools, religious education in the curriculum, collective worship, but also on citizenship education and PSHE. And those two topics have also been prominent throughout the history of Humanist UK's educational policy remit, as you'll hear later from some of our, at least one, maybe both, of our future speakers at this event. And they were, again, issues that motivated me to support Humanist UK back in the day. My job before I came to Humanist UK was with an organisation called the Citizenship Foundation, which advocated for citizenship education in state schools and was founded by Bernard Crick, a political scientist who was also a vice president of Humanists UK. It's not just in citizenship education that the humanist influence runs deep, but also in personal, social and health education. One of the vice presidents of Humanists UK when I first started here was James Hemming, who was one of the driving forces in the mid-20th century behind not just moral education, as we'll hear more from Maddie this evening, but also in the formulation and promotion of PSHE. And all of this curriculum work is in keeping with the humanist idea that education is about not just the transmission of knowledge and cultural heritage to young people, but also the development of skills, the development of capacities, all in the direction of achieving the production not just of educated learners, people who can step into the human heritage of knowledge in all the thematic subjects that we're familiar with, but developing people who have a moral sense, people who are emotionally integrated, people who are capable of making a contribution, not just in their own communities, but to our wider society as citizens, as well as fully formed individual human beings. And that broader sense of what education is about is, of course, one that stands behind all of Humanist UK's educational campaigning work. It's at the heart of our educational policy. More recently, of course, although our broader educational vision has achieved a lot of impact in shaping the zeitgeist of the educational world, in things like sex education, PSHE, citizenship education, and values education. The great unresolved issues for us in education are those that are about religious discrimination, religious privilege, and the violation of the human right to freedom of thought and choice of children. Our Faith Schools campaign, for which we've got an active fundraiser out this week, so do, if you feel you can make a donation to that, log on to contribute. Our Faith Schools campaign, of course, is one of our biggest campaigns and one of our longest standing. That's now led by Robert Cann, who Ruth Wareham is helping to transition into his new Faith Schools campaigner role as she returns to academia. And we're lucky that Ruth will also continue to support the campaign as an expert policy advisor and researcher at the same time as she returns to her philosophy of education career. Humanist UK champions children's rights in education and gives support and advice to non-religious families navigating a system that discriminates against them at every turn. And on this issue, like many others, unfortunately, of our policy platform, the current government is very hostile to the idea of change. Over the last decade, all the political parties have disappointingly made a deliberate shift away from critiquing faith schools for fear of upsetting religious constituents and interest groups. But we know that many members of Parliament privately do agree with us that the present system is in need of serious reform, and part of our challenge in the next decade is going to be to unlock their support in Parliament and local councils, to bring together the non-religious population who are directly affected by these issues to make their concerns just as tangible to politicians as those of religious groups, and to educate the public at large, to continue to inform and educate the public at large about the issues to do with faith schools. This was the standout contribution of Humanist UK in 2001, 2002. The public debate at the time was very shaped by the Church of England's propaganda for itself, and also by the then government's entirely false claims about the efficacy, supposed efficacy of religious schooling. BHA, as it then was the principal driver of the public mood away from that sentiment through media work and through public-facing campaigns. And we need to do that again, because in the last decade, many members of the public of this new generation have been led to think deliberately that these schools do not discriminate when they definitely do, or that they pay for themselves when they're entirely state funded, or that they teach a balanced and unbiased curriculum when we know that in many cases they do not. So that's a quick summary of our work and why it's important. Our two speakers this evening that will now follow me before you have an opportunity to ask your questions of them are Madeleine Goodall, who has been working, many of you will have seen her previous contributions to previous events this year, all of which have been stimulating, and really they've held us spellbound, giving an insight into her project. She's been, for the last 2 years, working as the Humanist Heritage Coordinator, looking at our history as an organisation in celebration of our 125th anniversary year. And the work she's done has been, really fascinating contribution to our understanding of ourselves, as well as our planning for the future by understanding the past. And you'll hear also from Dr Ruth Wareham, who, as I mentioned at the beginning there, is our faith education campaigner transitioning out of that role back into academia and supporting Robert Cowan, our new education campaigner, in his work. I'll hand over now then to Madeleine Goodall to give us some of the context and explain why we're holding this meeting today, this year, and the historical context of the important work that you've all been supporting through a membership of Humanist UK, and that our staff have been working on now for so long.
Thank you, Andrew, for a very lovely introduction, actually. Spellbound, I hope that carries on today. As Andrew mentioned, today we are celebrating not just 125 years of, Humanist UK and our efforts for education, not indoctrination. We're also celebrating a specific day, which is the inaugural meeting of the Moral Instruction League, which I will talk a little bit about in a kind of whirlwind fashion, as usual. I suspect that lots of the people that are here today are especially interested in the present day, but as I say, like so much of the work of Humanist UK, today's work for inclusive education has a really long history, and humanist involvement in those efforts, even before the formal creation of Humanist UK as we know it today in 1896, has an even longer history than that. One of those earliest examples has been written about really excellently by one of our volunteers, actually, on the Humanist Heritage website, about the National Education League, which was founded in Birmingham in 1869 to campaign for free, compulsory, non-sectarian education for all children in England and Wales. The main result, ultimately, of the League's activities and their campaigning was the passing of the Elementary Act of 1870, which met some, although not all, of their objectives. And present at the League's first ever conference and a member of its council was George Jacob Holyoake, who put forward an idea of practical secular education for all, and we'll hear more from him later. This quote that's on here now is from one of the participants, one of the other participants at that original conference, and really sums up much of the objectives and values that still underpin the work of humanists today. No child should be made ashamed or uncomfortable on account of his father's or mother's opinions or lack of opinions on subjects of theological speculation. No child should imbibe lessons of sectarian hatred or be encouraged to think himself better than another child because he has been taught something different about creed or catechism, which was at the heart of those early efforts by the National Education League, which included many humanists, and continued to animate lots of those activists as time went on, even after the passing of that act. So, education, not indoctrination, a brief, longer history before the formation of the Moral Instruction League. That 1870 Education Act had created what were called school boards, so public bodies in England and Wales, which established and administered elementary schools. Its members were directly elected, and each board could raise funds from a rate, build and run non-denominational schools where existing voluntary provision was inadequate. They could subsidise church schools if it was appropriate. They could support the poorest children to attend those schools by paying the fees. And they were not to impose any religious education, any compulsory religious education, other than simple Bible reading. And it's significant to note that women were eligible for election to school boards, and many women and men in the early ethical movement did in fact sit on them. One of the earliest to take advantage of the creation of these school boards in 1870 was a remarkable woman called Lydia Becker. A freethinker, Lydia Becker was deliberately guarded about her religious beliefs or lack thereof at the time, as many were, but her opposition to religious instruction in schools nevertheless drew the suspicion of many. In a letter to a close friend at the end of the 1860s, Becker had asserted her devotion to the scientific method above all else, and she suggested a clear distaste for the unverifiable, but nonetheless a sympathy for those with religious faith. In spite of her attempts to be tactful, her perceived disapproval of religious doctrine was ultimately damaging to her school board career. Following a visit to a school in 1873, she'd requested the removal of scriptural phrases from the walls, and this was met with outrage from religious members of the school board. And ultimately exploited as well by opponents in the press, which resulted in a disappointing performance in the next election for the school board. She had, though, helped to bring the subject of religion, or perhaps keep it, in schools into the realm of public debate, even at great risk to her own reputation, which is something that interestingly foreshadows as a description the reception of Margaret Knight 70 years later in 1955 with her Morals Without Religion broadcasts. 2 decades after Holyoake had advocated for practical secular education at the National Education League meeting, Arthur Spalding, shown on the left here, was arguing in Watt's Literary Guide, which is now the New Humanist, that if schools are to be maintained by the community, the teaching must be upon subjects in the utility of which all citizens are agreed. And 2 years later, in the same publication, an author wrote, "Rightly handled, the school might be one of the strongest levers for the uplifting of mankind. But it will be asked, on what sanctions will you rest your moral instruction? The answer is, on no external or extra-human sanction. Virtue is its own sanction. The bad method of bidding children act rightly on pain of God's displeasure should be set aside. Let us strive to create a stronger self-respect." And this author was Frederick James Gould, writing here under a pseudonym. He was a founder of the Moral Instruction League and a lifelong promoter of secular education. And as he was still working for the school board in 1894, when this was published, his use of a pseudonym was calculated. He'd previously been reprimanded by his superiors in the school he worked in for publishing his views on religion and theology. In his autobiography, Life Story of a Humanist, Gould later described this particular pamphlet as drawing a lugubrious howl from the Daily Chronicle, which, needless to say, was just one howl of many. But the idea expressed by Gould here, that virtue is its own sanction, was at the heart of the Union of Ethical Societies, Humanists UK today, of which, of course, Gould was a founding member. This note on the founding of the Union clearly indicates the intention in 1896, when it was founded, to organise ethics classes, to have lectures on moral instruction, and to have non-religious Sunday schools. So you can see here, and I've highlighted it as well, that the organisation of an ethics class, lectures on moral instruction for the young, management of Sunday schools, and correspondence with provincial sympathisers was central to the goal of the Union from the start, which, although it began with 4 London societies, quickly expanded, just as the work of the Moral Instruction League did. Gould himself had, in 1899, been among those who formed the East London Ethical Society, which had groups for young people and a secular Sunday school. And Gould later recalled that while there, he found in storytelling on themes of personal and social conduct a blessed relief, I'm quoting him, from the harsh methods of the board school and an experimental field for humanist ideas. This image shows Gould in Leicester, where he later moved with others from the Leicester Secular Society, possibly the Sunday school there. The Moral Instruction League's inaugural meeting was held on 7th of December 1897, so 124 years ago today. And for almost 2 decades, it was a driving force in the promotion and development of secular moral education on a national and international scale. And the ongoing work of Humanists UK in the areas of compulsory collective worship, faith schools, religious instruction, and the representation of non-religious worldviews has its direct origins in the efforts of the Moral Instruction League, formed well over a century ago by these 4 very significant individuals, as well as a number of others. And it emerged from the convictions expressed by Gould and other members of the ethical movement on virtue as being a sanction or reward in itself. And that belief at the heart of the Union of Ethical Societies, that goodness was distinct from religion and that morality did not rely on theology. And that could, of course, and should, of course, be thus expanded to theories about education and to the education of young people. Of the League's inaugural meeting, the South Place magazine, now Conway Hall's Ethical Record, reported a well-attended public meeting convened by the Moral Instruction School Board Election Conference was held at the St Martin's Town Hall on Tuesday, 7th of December 1897, to consider the formation of a permanent National Moral Instruction League, having for its object the replacing of the present religious teaching in all state-aided schools by systematic non-theological moral instruction. And letters expressing sincere approval of the objects of the meeting were read by Zona Valence, who was the honorary secretary of the League, as well as Humanists UK's first honorary secretary, its first chief executive. And these letters were from those who couldn't be there but were in support of the League. And these included a remarkable array of individuals. Pioneering suffragist and women's rights campaigner Elizabeth Wolstenholme-Elmy, novelist and new woman Mona Caird, nursery school pioneer and activist for free school meals Margaret Macmillan, scientist and evolutionary theorist Alfred Russel Wallace, banker, writer and anthropologist Edward Clodd, jurist, historian and positivist Frederick Harrison, coiner of secularism himself George Jacob Holyoake, founder of the Independent Labour Party Keir Hardie, and Liberal MP Charles Swan, later Swan. Schwann's wife, Elizabeth, who was an activist in her own right, was present at the meeting and had chaired the first annual Congress of the Union of Ethical Societies the previous year. Dr. Stanton Coit moved, Reverend J. Page Hopp seconded, and Mrs. Charles Edward Swan and Mr. George W. Foote supported the following resolution. This meeting declares that in the highest interests of the nation, it is essential to replace the present religious teaching in state schools by non-theological instruction in personal and civic duties, and to make character the chief aim in school life. And this trio, a Unitarian minister, an activist, and a prominent secularist, give a fairly good indication of the range of people who were drawn to the Moral Instruction League and took an active part within it. The creation of this, though, as I mentioned, emerged from even earlier efforts for non-denominational inclusive education by secularists and freethinkers. As I noted, Elizabeth Wolstenholme-Elmy submitted a letter of support on the foundation of the League, and she's pictured here with Emmeline Pankhurst, who again provides a further fascinating glimpse into the early workings of the non-religious for educational reform. Emmeline Pankhurst's husband, Richard Pankhurst, had stood unsuccessfully for Parliament in 1883, and he'd campaigned on a platform which his daughter Sylvia Pankhurst described as probably the most challenging ever offered to a British constituency, which included the removal from the British Constitution of all non-representative elements. That meant the abolition of the monarchy and the House of Lords, adult suffrage for both sexes, the disestablishment and disendowment of the church, and importantly, free compulsory secular education. Emmeline Pankhurst herself came to the aid of another pioneering suffragist and humanist, Teresa Billington Greig, who had sought Pankhurst's help while she was working as a teacher in Manchester, seeking to be excused from teaching religion. So it all comes together, really. But back, or rather forward, to the Moral Instruction League. As has continued to be the case, many pioneering educationists and dedicated teachers were drawn to and inspired by humanist values and those of the Moral Education League. Early and important supporters of moral education included Alice Woods, who was a champion of co-education, Sophie Bryant, who was a mathematician and one of the first 2 women to graduate from the University of London, and the first woman in the UK to be awarded Doctor of Science, and Ruth Homan, who was a lifelong champion of social welfare and a founding figure of the ethical societies. And over the following years, the League circulated petitions and pamphlets, lectured, demonstrated, and achieved some considerable success in encouraging the provision of moral education in schools, which after 1902 were in the hands of local authorities. In 1908, the Moral Education Congress, the first international Moral Education Congress, brought delegates from across the world to discuss moral education. The Moral Instruction League later became the Moral Education League, then later the Civic and Moral Education League, and ultimately the Civic Education League. And as Andrew alluded to earlier, that sense of developing young people as citizens directly carries through from this early work and into the work of humanists in education today. And despite the League's ultimate winding up in the 1920s, educational efforts continued to remain central to the organised humanist movement through publications, campaigns, interfaith dialogue, legal challenges where necessary, and education committees. And the following slides show just some of the publications which testify to this legacy, not least from the 1960s onwards, when there was really an enormous expansion and focus on what was then the BHA's activities in this area. So here are some of the publications from the 1960s. The 1970s, in the General Statement of Policy, Humanists in Education, and I'm sure you'll be able to see these slides afterwards, so please don't try in this rapid fire round to read all of this. But essentially, that key line here, children are individual people, not private possessions of their parents. The community should ensure that they receive certain basic opportunities, really underpinned their whole attitude. Objective, fair and balanced, in the 1970s, along with Wider Horizons, which was suggestions for modern and inclusive in assemblies, contributed to by many teachers, shared values and learning together, both about that sense of inclusivity and learning alongside one another, rather than divided by religion or on any other basis. And moving finally to one of the pamphlets from the 2000s, which really talks again about that more modern and increasingly recent and relevant history to us now. And I will end there, because otherwise I'll talk forever and hand over to Ruth, who can talk much more about the current and recent activities for humanist education.
Thank you. It's really great to be here tonight in this quite short presentation. As Maddie said, I'm just going to give you a brief idea of the current situation with relation to the influence of religion in schools, as well as some of the work that we are doing to address it. I'll be largely focusing on England, but I will have a little bit to say about Wales and Northern Ireland as we go along. I'll also provide a few suggestions on what you can do to help to support our campaigns if we've done our job in convincing you that the current situation needs to change. Okay, so I shall start with religious education, which is a statutory subject at all schools. However, of course, faith schools are permitted to meet their legal requirements via the provision of religious instruction, which is taught from a particular faith perspective. And so that means that many pupils in faith schools are essentially denied access to the kind of pluralist, non-partisan religious education that's really necessary for them to make informed decisions about their own beliefs, as well as to live well with those who have differing religions or beliefs in a democratic society. You might be forgiven for thinking that if you attend a non-denominational school, maybe the picture's better, and in some respects it is, because you won't be given faith-based instruction, but attendance at a non-denominational school doesn't guarantee a good quality or even actually any religious education. In fact, nearly half of pupils who currently attend non-denominational academies actually receive no designated religious education classes at Key Stage 4. And in many schools, children still aren't taught about non-religious worldviews like humanism in religious education, despite the fact that this is actually unlawful, something that we established in a legal case back in 2015. Wales is leading the way with respect to improving this situation. You might have read about reforms there through the new Curriculum and Assessment Act, which include explicitly putting humanism on an equal footing with religions in lessons which will be called religion, values and ethics. So broadening out the scope of the subject so that it's not just narrowly focused on religion. Moving on then to faith schools. So around 34% of state schools in England have a designated religious character. In Wales, this is lower, so 15%, but in Northern Ireland, much higher, because all of the schools in Northern Ireland actually have a Christian ethos. Faith schools may legally provide RE, as we've already heard, in line with their faith, but they might also provide relationships and sex education and collective worship in line with the tenets of their religion, and they may also select their pupils on the basis of faith. There is a 50% cap on religious selection in free schools, so those are new academy schools, and there's a presumption that new schools that open are free schools. So in most new schools that open, this 50% cap applies. Unfortunately, however, the government recently launched a new funding scheme that allows new voluntary aided schools to open, and they can select 100% of their pupils by faith when they have a religious character. Why do we oppose religious selection? Well, the evidence shows that religious selection divides children along ethnic and socio-economic lines as well as by religion, so it segregates children. There is a slight domination in the league tables of faith schools, which sometimes leads people to try and argue that they provide better education, but actually all of the research done on this shows that this is largely attributable to the selectivity and not to the religious character of the school. Third, religiously diverse schools are actually better at fostering attitudes conducive to social cohesion. And if you're interested in reading up on any of that background information, if you navigate to our campaigns pages, there are links to lots of evidence to show that this is the case. Faith schools may also deprioritise children who are or were in care but don't share the faith in their admissions. So community schools are required to put all looked after and previously looked after children at the top of their admissions criteria. But although faith schools have to prioritise children of their faith who are looked after or previously looked after, they can put children not of the faith below all other children of their faith. And some research that we did this year found that 76% of Catholic secondary schools do this, and 100% of Jewish secondary schools do this. Let's have a little bit of a look at the picture of what's been happening this year in terms of faith schools. The second of those voluntary aided faith schools I mentioned that's been legally permitted to select 100% of its pupils by religion. It's the second to open in over a decade, was approved in Kingston. It's a Church of England school. The first is going to open in Peterborough and was approved last year, and that's going to be a Catholic school. Perhaps testament to our campaigning on this issue that there are only 2 of these schools opening so far, and actually neither of them in the first instance are going to be selecting 100% of their pupils. So the C of E one has said that it will select a third of its pupils on faith grounds, and the Catholic one has said that it will select 80% of its pupils on faith grounds. And this is a big move for the Catholic schools, because they previously argued that any sort of cap goes against canon law. So this surely proves that that isn't the case if they are able to countenance an 80% cap, even though, of course, we'd like to see no religious selection whatsoever. This year, 3 new faith schools have been approved or approved in principle via Wave 14 of the government's free school programme, and Wave 15 details are to be announced, so we're waiting on those. And if we look at the schools in the pipeline, there are 17 faith-based free schools in the pre-opening phase. Most of those are Church of England schools, so 10 Church of England schools, 5 general Christian ethos, 1 Hindu and 1 Muslim. Now, that number of Church of England schools is particularly hard to understand, given that the Church's most recent worshipping community data shows that actually the entire worshipping community of the Church is smaller than the number of children attending Church of England schools. So in terms of influence, it's moving vastly in the wrong direction in terms of the proportion of the population who actually adhere to the faith. We can also take a little bit of a look at illegal religious schools. This is an issue that we've been working very closely on since 2013. We've worked with a number of whistleblowers from religious communities to uncover evidence of thousands of children being taught in these settings. These schools often operate in dirty and unsafe conditions where there's a complete lack of safeguarding. Pupils are taught a very narrowly religious religious curriculum, and some have been exposed to extremist material and also corporal punishment. There's a real pressing requirement for more joined up regulation of the unregistered out of school and home education settings, because various loopholes in the law come together to allow them to operate. And the law on what constitutes a school, as well as Ofsted and local authority powers of oversight and enforcement, really need to be clearer and more robust. And this is something we've been lobbying the government about for many years. The government has made some, but very slow progress on shutting illegal schools, just 4 successful prosecutions so far. But following our work, it has proposed reforms. Unfortunately, though, when we ask how long it will take for those reforms to actually come to fruition, it says it's a top priority, but just says that will happen in due course. Moving on to collective worship then. So all schools, even those without a designated religious character, must by law conduct a daily act of collective worship, and in most schools that's required to be broadly Christian in character. And in that context, worship doesn't just mean reflection or, you know, a pause in the day where children talk about different values, etc. Even though some schools do interpret it as such, it means reverence or veneration paid to a divine being or power, and that's how it's talked about in the most recent guidance. I say the most recent guidance, that was actually published in 1994, so is obviously greatly in need of updating. And for this reason, the existence of collective worship means that there aren't really any straightforwardly secular schools in England. You'll sometimes hear people referring to faith schools and secular schools. We don't have secular schools because every school is required to have worship. There is a parental right to withdraw from collective worship, and sixth formers are legally entitled to withdraw themselves, but withdrawal can be really difficult, and some schools are less than helpful with respect to facilitating that request. And it's isolating and disruptive for the pupils. There's also no meaningful alternative to worship offered. So often children who are withdrawn just end up either sitting in hallways or in classrooms on their own with nothing really meaningful to do. You might have noticed that the Education and Assemblies Bill, which is passing through the Lords at the moment, and we were involved with supporting Baroness Burt, who's the Vice Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Humanist Group, to table the bill, seeks to introduce fully inclusive non-partisan assemblies that are suitable for all children, irrespective of background. So that would remove the necessity for collective worship in schools without a religious character and introduce a requirement for these inclusive assemblies that are suitable for everybody. It would also introduce a meaningful alternative to worship in faith schools, so we could put an end to children who've been withdrawn sitting alone with nothing much to do. We'll have a brief go through the position on relationships and sex education. This is an area where we achieved quite a bit in the last few years. In September 2020, compulsory relationships and sex education was introduced in all secondaries, and compulsory relationships education in all primary schools. And there was a bit of flexibility around implementation that was granted in light of the pandemic, but all schools are supposed to have this up and running by now. Unfortunately, however, there is this caveat in the statutory guidance which says the subject must be appropriate to the religious background of the pupils, and that faith schools can teach it in line with the tenets of their faith. LGBT issues are supposed to be taught, but only at a timely point, and the guidance leaves schools free to determine when this point is, and primary schools can avoid it altogether, although arguably under the Equality Act they would need to acknowledge their LGBT pupils and parents. the problem with these sorts of faith-based carve-outs to policy is really strongly illustrated by some work we did on a resource called A Fertile Heart this year. That's a Catholic RSE resource, which amongst other things was teaching pupils that in relationships, in sexual relationships, men are initiators and women are receiver responders. It also included a lot of problematic content on contraception that was pseudoscientific, talked about contraception as a moral danger, and signposted to resources which said that LGBT people, gay marriages weren't actually marriages, and so essentially gay people should never have sex at all because they could never be married. So that really highlights the issue with faith-based carve-outs to RSE. In Wales, they're removing the current right to withdraw that does still exist in England for sex education, and as a result that means that legally RSE has to be taught in an objective, critical and pluralistic way, even in the context of faith school. So again, Wales is moving ahead of the rest of the UK in terms of this inclusive provision. So you might be thinking, well, okay, so you've shown me a lot of issues that exist currently in the education system, some of them similar issues to the ones that Maddie was talking about. How can I help with this? How can I push this campaign on? Well, one is in your local area, if you come across proposals for a religious free school or a fully selective voluntary aided school, when these arise, we're always looking for local campaigners who are prepared to stand against them, and we will always be publicising these as and when they arise, so keep an eye out for that. Similarly, you might want to champion inclusive RE at your child or your grandchild's school, including by asking for a humanist school speaker, and you can find out how to do that on our website. You might consider requesting a meaningful alternative to collective worship at your child's school. We have taken a legal case on this where we won permission to have the case judicially reviewed, and at that point the school allowed a family to have a meaningful alternative to collective worship at the school, and we think that the legal arguments are pretty strong there. So if you are prepared to speak to your child's school about introducing such a thing, we would be happy to work with you to see if we can put that in place. You can respond to national and local consultations as they arise. So there are regular consultations on local admissions, but there are also national ones that, again, we publicise on our campaigns pages and on our news pages. So the best way to find out about all of these is to follow us on Facebook or Twitter and receive updates on all our current campaigns and take actions. And of course, if there are questions that you have, or you want more information on any of this, aside from obviously the questions that we're going to go into in a moment, you can always drop me an email, and I'm happy to work with people and discuss the issues as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ruth.
Have you had a chance to monitor any of the questions that we have been receiving?
I have indeed. So I'm wondering what we should start with. Well, if we start with the first question from John in the chat, which relates to the history, and then lots of the other ones are actually more contemporary. So
okay.
Yeah. So John said, fascinating to see the history of efforts to remove religious privilege from education. It seems that there was a bit of a gap in achievement from the 1900s to the 1970s. Was this the case? And if so, what do you think the main reasons were for this? Which is a really interesting point, and I think partly the result of two things. One was that I skimmed quickly through from the Moral Instruction League through to the more recent history. But there were other reasons for that too, I think. One is that the what was then the Ethical Union was itself quite affected by well, things like the World Wars, which meant that they were much smaller and perhaps less active in some areas than they had previously been and would ultimately become. But also that they were doing things. They were still very concerned with education. They were still passing resolutions at annual congresses, for example, and working as individuals and as members of the Ethical Union to well, for different things, sometimes to abolish religious instruction altogether, and sometimes to continue the emphasis on civic and moral education. But there were some major things that happened in the 50s, for example, like Margaret Knight's Morals Without Religion talk, which really galvanized a lot of people, not just to start thinking more about the place of education in schools and religious instruction for young people, but also in joining the humanist movement because of that. And that kind of led partly to a really galvanized movement kind of from the mid-50s onwards, helped by people and key figures like Blackham, Harry Stopes Rowe, James Hemming, and those other figures who were very concerned with education. So hopefully that goes some way to answering it. And do look at the Humanist Heritage website, of course, if people are interested.
Maddie, can I just jump in with a historical question that occurred to me, because you mentioned that the League wound up in the 1920s, and I was just wondering why that was, or if you were aware as to why that was and what happened.
Yeah, it merged ultimately with, so first it moved into Le Play House, where there was a couple of other bodies which seem to have been seen to have, if not a similar rationale in terms of working primarily for greater civic participation and understanding. So it first kind of moved in with them and then ultimately became merged with them. So it seemed to kind of, I guess it's maybe perceived not to have a single mission or need on its own anymore, but to continue working within that kind of broader effort for better civic education, better kind of sociological understanding. And there are a couple of interesting things online about that. But yeah, it's an interesting one, because I think, as I say, moral education certainly was still a concern for members of the Ethical Union, who'd obviously kind of initiated the Moral Instruction League in the first place. So perhaps it seems a bit strange that it wasn't, but there were certainly people who had been directly involved with moral education and with the League itself that carried on being active within the organised movement and were still interested in it. So it kind of merged with other organisations, but didn't continue to have a life of its own.
Okay, thank you.
So having a look at this chat.
Shall I just take?
If any of them grab you.
Yeah. So So there are some that have shorter answers than others. So I'll pick up this first one. George Reed: are faith schools state subsidized? In other words, do all taxpayers pay for faith schools? Short answer: yes, they do. In fact, voluntary aided schools, the church or religious organisation that runs them is supposed to pay 10% of the capital funding, and in some cases they provide the buildings, though not always. Sometimes they lease them on a peppercorn rent, but that 10% has been gradually going down. over the years. And in fact, neither of these two new voluntary aided schools that will legally be able to select up to 100% of their pupils will actually pay anything from the religious organisation for their upkeep. The local councils are going to step in and pay that additional 10%. Now, there was sort of an argument at the time where the government had proposed getting rid of the cap, that this 10% would kind of be there so that the religious organisations could still do a higher level of religious selection, I guess, because the government had just proposed to get rid of it altogether, but there was a big campaign against that, and they decided that they were going to keep that cap. But because groups like the Catholic Education Service and the Board of Deputies of British Jews had maintained that there were religious arguments why they had to have total control of their admissions, it was sort of argued at the time that there would be a little bit of a payoff, i.e. there would be some government funding for these schools, but the religious organisations would have to contribute. It's not what's happening in practice. So in actual fact, all of us are paying our taxes for religious schools, and they're schools that perhaps, if it was our local school, our only local school, we might not be able to get access to it on the basis that we weren't religious. So yes, that is the unfortunate position that we are in. I can move down to, I saw another one mentioned, which I thought was particularly interesting, by somebody who's named only as Flying Monkey, which is a great screen name. Should Humanist UK campaign to change the school curriculum so that instead of teaching RE, schools teach modern RE, i.e. reason and ethics? Now, I think pragmatically, we have always been a supporter of religious education in that broadest sense. So education that teaches about religions and beliefs, that includes humanism on an equal footing. So we were actually a founder member of the Religious Education Council for England and Wales. So whilst I think we would love to see more reason and ethics, and actually the broadening scope in Wales is an example of this, where it's going to be called religion, values and ethics, I still think we would argue that it's very important that religious worldviews are covered, because religion is a big factor in lots of people's lives. It is a big factor in global politics, international affairs, and it's very important that children know about religion, but it should just be taught in this broader sense and not exclusively. So I think our argument would be, yes, we'd love to see more reason and ethics and values and all of that stuff included in the subject, but I don't think that we should jettison religious content altogether.
I'm just looking at another question. Well, there's a few. I mean, there are some that relate directly to kind of campaigning for education in schools, and others that link, I suppose, more to humanism itself. So one, for example, from John Ling in Manchester: one reason why religion is important to people is the routine of worship, the symbolism, the structure, the special occasions, the repetition of well-known stories, myths, etc., that bring great comfort in times of trouble. What routines or structures can humanists rely on? Which I think is interesting, and I think it's something that's come up in the context of talking about humanism and humanist values before. But I think it's also, I suppose, relevant to those supposed acts of collective worship or indeed inclusive assemblies. Do you have any kind of thoughts about that in its relation to schools?
Yes, I mean, schools are full of routines, and I think in terms of our work on inclusive assemblies, we really wanted to highlight the importance of that coming together as a school community, celebrating the achievements of different members of the school community, talking about their religion and non-religious worldviews, talking about current affairs, and so on and so forth. And so I don't think as humanists we would ever deny that those things are important to people and are an important factor in school life. The difficulty with collective worship is that it is exclusive. It pushes out people who don't have religious worldviews, and it's all very well to try and argue, well, you know, they don't have to participate or they can just sit and watch. But this is the thing that the most parents contact us about every year, because it is isolating for their children. They feel like they're on the outside of something. It's not done in an inclusive way, and so they're not part of the kind of ritual community life of the school. And so it's really important that when you're bringing that community together, you're bringing the whole community together. So I mean, quite apart from, you know, there's a question for individual humanists how we get that in our lives. And I think, you know, we have community with other people who both share our beliefs and don't share our beliefs, right? We interact with them. But the way it should work in a school is that a school should be a place where, you know, it's a diverse community, but everybody gets an opportunity to have their say and to feel like a valued member of that community. And I think the problem with collective worship is that it doesn't do that. It makes some people feel like they're on the outside of that because they can't give reverence to a deity that they don't believe in.
Which is again actually something that strikes me as really consistently a challenge and a fact all the way through, with lots of actually subsequent education acts. So 1902, 1944, and then the 1980s as well, this idea that that being able to withdraw your child from something like collective worship or religious instruction is a good alternative, when that is something that right from those earliest days of advocating for moral instruction, for example, they were aware of that. People like Gould himself really struggled with the idea of, as a teacher even, being asked to not deliver religious instruction because he didn't believe in it, and similarly then within the Moral Instruction League, and as others did, challenge that idea of withdrawal being a kind of good alternative to something that was more inclusive, something that was more kind of balanced and involved everyone and all young people in kind of shared civic and moral lessons. So yeah, which is just to say again, I think, which has been certainly the kind of thought for me over lots of the research of in the history as well, that there's been lots of kind of change in some ways, but quite a bit of continuity and continued frustrations in others. So I do notice that we are at 8 now, so we are happy to carry on. There are quite a few questions still to be addressed. Obviously this will go up on the YouTube channel, so if you do have to leave now we're at 8, then feel free to, and hopefully you could catch up if you'd like. Otherwise I think we could probably have a look at a few more of the questions. Are there any others, Ruth, that you've seen that you'd like to speak to?
I don't think we'll get through all 15 or 16.
No, unfortunately not.
that we have got in that time. Bear with me 1 second. Okay, so I'll go to this one. What do you believe are the main factors that might accelerate the removal of religious worship from schools, and what can ordinary members of Humanist UK do to assist this? I mean, one of the big things that's happened in terms of collective worship recently is, of course, this private members bill that's going through the House of Lords at the moment and is actually due to have its third reading tomorrow. Unfortunately, in terms of that making a change to the law, it's fairly unlikely because the government is refusing to back it. So in the second reading debate on the bill, they tried to argue that there's enough flexibility already in the law to permit schools to have very inclusive provision. But then in the next breath, they also acknowledged that that didn't mean non-religious provision. So one wonders how inclusive that is then of half the population if it is the case that you can't include half of the population's beliefs. And obviously amongst younger people, actually those numbers are even higher according to the British Social Attitudes Survey. So in terms of legal change, one area that we have is of course the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child has actually in its last report on the UK pressed for the law on collective worship to be repealed and for children to actually be able to withdraw themselves, because of course it's seen as violating children's rights. Unfortunately, nothing happened after that report in 2016, but they are pressing again. They've just put out what's called the list of issues prior to reporting, and collective worship was on the list for governments to report back on what they've done. And although, unfortunately, I think in England, in terms of really taking strong action on human rights, on children's rights, the government's not particularly on board with that. In Wales, the whole new curriculum is underpinned by a commitment to the UNCRC. So at the moment, we are trying to argue with the Welsh government, at the very least, that this actually actively undermines what you're trying to do. You've done the radical stuff on religion, values and ethics. You've made it fully inclusive, and then you just have this odd hangover of collective worship. So I think potentially if it changes in Wales, that could snowball elsewhere. Also worth saying, there is a legal case currently being, it's just gone through the courts in Northern Ireland that looked at collective worship, and the judgment is being considered as we speak. So, if we get a positive judgment there, that could change the law in Northern Ireland potentially. In terms of what individual members of Humanists UK can do, I mentioned it on that final slide. So they're actually talking to your child or your grandchild's school about, what is their collective worship provision? Because a lot of schools aren't compliant. But what meaningful alternative do they offer? Because we actually think at the very least there should be something else offered for children who are withdrawn from collective worship. And at the time we were supporting the Harrises to take their legal case, we put together a pack to help support parents to make that request. So my advice would be, perhaps get in touch if there's a particular thing that you're worried about in terms of what's happening with collective worship at your child's school, initiate a discussion, and then potentially, if we got lots of parents who were requesting this meaningful alternative, it might snowball in and kind of make change from the bottom up, or at least improve the situation in individual schools. And if you can then show that there's an appetite for it, because what governments always say is, well, nobody's complaining about it. Partly they're not complaining about it because they don't know about it. We did some polling recently that found that I think it was 65% of parents were unaware that the collective worship law existed. But then 60% didn't think, once they were told about it, that it should be enforced, and only 24% thought that it should be enforced. So some of them had literally just heard about it and weren't sure. So you know, people aren't complaining because they don't necessarily know that it exists, and provision is patchy and different from school to school, but all it takes is an overzealous head teacher saying, well, this is what the law says, and you have a very strong, very religious collective worship happening. So I think on the ground we can challenge it, and we will continue to try and lobby from the top end.
There are a few questions, I suppose, that are partially linked. Maybe I can sneak two in one. So one person asks, what do you think are the real reasons behind the government's intransigence in insisting on the continuation of a daily act of worship in schools? And perhaps linked, maybe, you mentioned the problem of MPs not wanting to upset religious constituents. What can be done to get around this? Is it fair to put those together?
What can be done to get around MPs not
wanting to upset their religious constituents? So I assume trying to kind of strike that balance. It's quite difficult, isn't it? But then I suppose there is that intransigence.
I mean, in terms of that, I sometimes think that is overplayed by MPs and ministers and, you know, policymakers more broadly, because a lot of the concerns that we have are to do with broadening out, making sure that everybody is included in a way that benefits religious people and non-religious people, right? It's about ensuring that everybody is treated equally and that everybody's rights are valued. Now, in terms of how do you get MPs to be on board with that, I mean, if I had the answer to that question, we perhaps would be further ahead than we are today. I think we continue to meet with MPs as often as we can. We continue to ask our, you know, members and supporters to get in touch with their MPs, to actually be aware how many people are non-religious and how big a constituency we make as well. I mean, that's something that I think we really need to focus on. But yes, it's a difficult one to answer, and I really do wish that I had a better answer than that. But of course, if you as members and supporters have ideas about what might get through to your local MP specifically, we're always willing to hear those as well. Was there another question there, Maddie, that
I think that's well answered. We've got a couple of others that again maybe link or maybe are best answered through kind of direct contact. There's a question, for example, about schools that have no specific faith denomination but are run by Christian fundamentalists, and how the religious influence of those can be reduced or challenged. But that is from an employee of one such school, so I don't know if that's best to.
Yes, yeah, I mean, that is a tricky situation that we have at the moment, because the way the school system is at the moment, it's increasingly the case that organisations that are faith-based are taking over schools that don't have a religious character. And although that's not supposed to interfere with the character of the school, quite often that does happen. And it was particularly interesting in the collective worship case we took, because that was a school run by a Church of England multi-academy trust, but a school that was not supposed to have a faith character. And what I found interesting all the way through that case was, whenever I looked at the comments on the media coverage of it, people were saying things like, oh, well, if you send your children to a faith school, what do you expect? And you had to keep informing them, this isn't a faith school, this isn't a religious school. Not that it would be okay in the context of a faith school. However, you know, this is actually a reality in our schools that don't have a religious character. And I think people are shocked by that. I think that is one of the main reasons why parents do get in touch with us about collective worship, because they genuinely think they've picked a secular school for their child. And then this worship is happening, their child comes home and says something that they think, well, where have they got that from? I I don't understand what's happening. And then at that point they become aware of it. And so, I mean, one thing to say is that if religion is seeping into the broader character of the school in a way that it ought not to be, we can help and support with that. That has been the subject of legal challenges before, and we can offer support on that side of things. But of course, until we actually have these archaic laws changed, it is difficult to navigate, precisely because some head teachers, some senior leaders, some teachers will think this is the way it ought to be. This is how the school ought to be run, and that is difficult for parents to stand up against. So that's why we're here, to help with that.
That's great. That's a good note to end on. But that's why we're here. That's why the work continues, and that's why the involvement of members and supporters is so important as well. So thank you. Thanks, Ruth. We'll need to wrap up now. I think we've run 15 minutes over, and I think we could probably talk for a lot longer. Really sorry if we didn't get to your question, and we had lots and all really interesting, but thank you for sending them in, and thanks for being with us.